Right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating dialogue around faith, statistics, and human suffering. We're going to map out the ultimate friction points between atheism and theology, and we're doing it completely neutrally based on the source material. If you've ever found yourself wrestling with why people believe what they believe, well, buckle up because this is going to be incredibly insightful.
Now, the statistical hook that actually challenged an 18-year-old agnostic in our source material is honestly kind of staggering. Get this, if a person is born into a Hindi or Muslim household, there is a 99% probability they will remain in that faith. Only a tiny 1% actually switch out. It really highlights how heavily your birthplace dictates what you ultimately believe.
And this isn't just isolated to specific regions either. Globally speaking, 91% of adults simply adopt and then keep their childhood religion. And that forces us to ask a pretty heavy question, right? How does this so-called birth lottery impact ultimate concepts like heaven and hell? I mean, if geography dictates your belief, does it also determine your salvation?
Which brings us to Section 1, the birth lottery.
This demographic reality creates a massive divide between the two camps. The atheist argument basically says, look, a geographic lottery is inherently unfair. If getting into heaven requires a very specific belief, but that belief is largely dictated by where you happen to be born, then the whole system is rigged. But the theological counterargument comes at it from a totally different angle. They view being born into a specific faith context not as some random accident, but as a God-given privilege. And crucially, with that privilege comes a moral responsibility to actually act upon it.
To really ground this idea, let's look at the famous Princeton ethicist and new atheist Peter Singer. During a debate over in Australia against a Christian mathematician, Singer actually deployed this exact statistical argument. He confidently said, "Well, there goes my best objection to religion. People always stay in the religion in which they're brought up."
But, in a twist that absolutely sent cyberspace mad, his opponent pointed out a rather glaring irony. Singer's own parents were atheists, meaning Singer himself had remained in the exact belief system he was brought up in. It perfectly demonstrates how atheism can actually function as its own worldview or faith system. And honestly, to make the irony even richer, the very first person Singer met when he walked off that stage was a Hungarian Jew who had transitioned to Christianity, literally completely defying his entire statistical rule.
Moving on to Section 2, Beauty and Barbed Wire.
So every single worldview, whether it's totally secular or deeply religious, has to face a very mixed picture of reality. Because let's be honest, we live in a world of profound, breathtaking beauty, but also a world of barbed wire and bombs. And this uneven, often brutal distribution of suffering prompts a foundational question. Is there really enough evidence in all this chaos to trust a higher power?
When you're grappling with massive unknowns like this, embracing the term agnostic actually makes a lot of sense. The word itself comes from the Greek agnosko, which literally just translates to "I don't know." It's not a cop-out at all. It's actually a profoundly logical starting point for learning and a really honest admission of open-mindedness.
The brilliant Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman put it perfectly. He advises us to bend over backwards to criticize yourself because you are the easiest person for yourself to deceive. And that hits the nail on the head. Whether you are a devout believer or a staunch atheist, genuine, honest exploration means we have to rigorously challenge our own biases.
And that leads us to Section 3, Omniscience and Suffering.
There is this terrifying, highly visceral example popularized by comedian Ricky Gervais that really challenges the concept of an all-knowing God. He asks, if God is truly omniscient, meaning he knows exactly what will happen before it happens, and he foresees a baby being born with a parasite that will literally eat its eye from the inside out, why even create that child? If God has the power to intervene but chooses not to, how in the world is creating a doomed soul an act of love? It's a heavy, heavy question.
Now, the theological counterargument doesn't just offer a simple, neatly packaged answer to that kind of horror. Instead, it points to the idea of cosmic compensation. First, they present the cross of Christ as evidence of a God who actually enters into human suffering alongside us. And second, drawing on thinkers like C.S. Lewis, they introduce the multiple worlds concept. The idea here is that the resurrection promises that any innocent suffering will be ultimately, overwhelmingly compensated for in another world.
To kind of anchor this high-level theology back in human reality, the source material looks at lived experiences. As humans, we naturally analyze these problems using our God-given capacities for moral sensing and love. But on a much more intimate level, individuals facing immense tragedies, like someone facing near-death surgery 14 years ago, or survivors dealing with the total devastation of the New Zealand earthquakes, have reported a fascinating phenomenon. By leaning into this specific belief, they experienced an unexplainable, total peace and profound hope, right in their absolute darkest moments.
Let's turn to Section 4, Morality versus Forgiveness.
When you're presented with the Christian requirement of a specific belief, a very natural question pops up. What about all those humans who lived before Jesus even existed? People like Abraham or Moses? Or what about someone alive today who just simply tries their absolute best to live a good, kind life? Does a lack of specific theological knowledge just automatically disqualify them?
While the source text presents one incredibly fascinating theological proposition that answers this directly, God will never judge anybody for not knowing what they couldn't possibly have known. It suggests a level of divine fairness that completely accounts for historical or geographic ignorance.
However, there is a really stark contrast here in what actually constitutes a good life. You see, the secular baseline is essentially just trying to live well and be kind. Simple enough, right? But the Christian view suggests that humans fundamentally lack the power to live perfectly. The argument goes that if you genuinely compare your daily life to the extreme moral standards of the Sermon on the Mount for just 1 week, you're going to uncover a deep, inherent need for forgiveness. And this is a transformative realization that's been witnessed in the most extreme environments imaginable, even among inmates on death row in Russia.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the psychology of belief. Stepping away from the theology for a second, the behavioral data tells a wildly compelling story. Hitting rock bottom, when your life becomes seemingly hopeless, statistically increases the probability that you'll turn to religion. A crisis of meaning essentially acts as a massive catalyst for faith. And the data shows that, well, it works. Finding belief provides a measurable, massive boost in psychological meaning by connecting individuals to something entirely outside of themselves.
But here is the massive friction point. Survey data reveals that devout followers of entirely different and frankly contradictory faiths report the exact same psychological boost. A devout Christian, a devout Muslim, and a devout Hindu all report a high meaning boost and a high sense of peace. The psychological benefit is totally uniform, regardless of the specific theology they're practicing.
And this leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question. We know that purely fictional movies can make us feel incredibly motivated and peaceful, right? So, if believing in totally contradictory faiths, or even, say, a flying spaghetti monster or a magical dragon at the bottom of the garden, provides genuine psychological comfort, does a feeling of peace actually prove objective truth? Or is it simply a hardwired human coping mechanism? It's a phenomenal question that really challenges both the skeptic and the believer to look a little deeper into why we hold the convictions we do. So, what do you think? I'll leave you to ponder that one.